A swing to the left in Colombia. Gustavo Petro becomes the country's first leftist head of state. The former rebel has vowed to champion radical reform. But with a nation divided, how much can really change? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Colombia. For decades, Colombia has been ruled by the center or the right. Even while so many other Latin American nations ushered in liberal politicians, Colombian voters consistently kept the left out. But now, for the first time in its history, voters backed the other side of the political spectrum.
Today is undoubtedly a historic day. We are writing history at this moment, a new history for Colombia, for Latin America, for the world. A new history because undoubtedly what has happened today with those 11 million voters is a change. What is coming is a real, fundamental change in which we are committing to the very existence of life itself.
Gustavo Petro's victory is historic for Colombia, not least because his running mate, environmentalist Francia Marquez, will become the country's first black vice president. Coming from a background of little or no economic privilege, she has promised to champion the poor. Still, the election was close. Right-wing rival Rodolfo Hernandez came in just under 50%, leaving the 62-year-old former mayor of Bogota with just a slim victory margin. When Gustavo Petro takes the presidential reins in August, he'll face a number of serious challenges. We'll explore those in a moment, but first, let's take a look at the president-elect's colorful past.
At just 17, Gustavo Petro joined the Colombian guerrilla group M19. It was formed in 1970 in response to alleged fraud during that year's presidential election. 8 years later, though, Petro was arrested and sentenced to 18 months behind bars for his role in the group. Then in 1991, he launched his political career. Petro was elected to Congress with the M19 Democratic Alliance Party. It was formed after the demobilization of the guerrilla group. After 3 terms in the Chamber of Representatives, he became a senator with the Alternative Democratic Pole. One of Gustavo Petro's biggest political achievements was when he was elected the mayor of Bogota, serving the Colombian capital between 2012 and 2015. The former rebel has long had aspirations for the presidency. In 2010, he came fourth. 8 years later, he lost to Iván Duque in a runoff.
Well, Colombia has long faced high levels of poverty, making it one of the most unequal countries in the world. Almost 8 million Colombians need humanitarian assistance, and violence still plagues the population. A 6-decade-long internal armed conflict has killed hundreds of thousands, and the 2016 peace deal with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, remains fragile. But Petro has promised to reinforce that accord, and with his history as a rebel, he may be best placed to do so. The National Liberation Army, or ELN, is one of the only recognized guerrilla groups left in the country, and in a statement on Monday, they said they're willing to talk to the president-elect.
The ELN remains active in its fight and political and military resistance, but also its disposition to advance in a peace process to further talks which started in Quito in February 2017.
So, will this remarkable turn to the left mark real change for Colombia, ushering in more peace and prosperity, especially for its marginalized populations? Well, joining me now to debate that are from Bogota, the director of the Colombia Risk Analysis Group, Sergio Guzman. Richard McCall joins us from London. He's a journalist normally based in Bogota and the host of the Colombia Calling podcast. And from Salt Lake City, Utah, is Laura Gamboa, a Latin America analyst and assistant professor of political science at the University of Utah. Thanks all so much for being with us. Sergio, I'll start with you to tell us why you are not necessarily celebrating this Petro Marquez victory.
Well, I think one of the key things to keep in mind is Petro doesn't have a clear mandate to execute the very broad policy changes that he has suggested. he has set very high, perhaps unrealistic expectations for the government's ability to deliver on that change. And I'm talking about having the state become the employer of last resort, cutting future oil exploration and future oil contracts, trying to keep coal on the ground, providing more subsidies for the elderly, not increasing taxes for the majority of the population. These things are not realistic to promise. And so Petro is pretty much going to start his mandate and unfulfill the expectations he's laid out to people. In addition to that, there's going to be high inflation. That's a global phenomenon. There's going to be political protests on the street, and fuel prices are inexorably going to rise. So Petro is setting himself up for failure, largely due to the very high and unrealistic expectations he has set for himself.
Okay, let me ask Laura what you think about that. I mean, does Petro just simply need a stronger mandate in order to be able to deliver on the basic promises he's made?
So a couple of things. First, I think the promises being made are, yes, part of them are just Petro overpromising, but I also think it's part of what people are asking for. Mm-hmm. I also think that most campaigns overpromise, right? Like we have had them across the globe. No campaign, especially not one in a boiling country like Colombia, can just succeed by saying, I'm just going to be really moderating my changes. As a matter of fact, Colombia had a moderate candidate that failed spectacularly. So I do agree that a lot of the promises are hard, if not impossible, to succeed. I also think that the diagnostic of the situation these policies seek to address is right. Like I think the pensions needs reforming. We need to move towards greener energies. Whether that is with the plan Petro promised or not, that's a whole different conversation. But I think promising these things is a part of sort of electoral politics, but I also think it's part of like a what people were asking for desperately.
You know, Laura, let's be honest, to address and to fix the huge levels of inequality in Colombia, radical change would be needed. So the question is actually, I mean, how much are Colombians themselves really ready for, especially given, as Sergio fairly points out, the margin of victory was quite slim?
I think it depends on which Colombians are you asking. So I think you have a good, important sector in Colombia that is really not ready for changes, especially sort of on the conservative side. And I'm not talking only kind of Uribista, which would be the far right in the spectrum, but also kind of centrist, more conservative politicians are also not ready. This would mark fulfilling Petro's promises would mark a significant change in the way we conceive the country and think of the country and its economy and how we distribute its resources.
Exactly.
Having said that, I don't think any president should fulfill the promises entirely. I think we should negotiate. This is a democracy after all. And so I have some hope that some of these promises will be put forward through Congress and then modified and adjusted. And it won't be exactly what Petro wants, but it won't be exactly status quo either.
It'll be, let's put it this way, Richard, I'll turn to you. I mean, this will be a work in progress. Colombians aren't expecting, Hugo Chavez to step in now, but they will slowly, incrementally, do you think at least, be able to adapt to some real change?
Well, it's a difficult one, really, because obviously Gustavo Petro and his vice presidential nominee, vice president now, Francia Marquez, they're quite uncompromising. They're quite uncompromising. They don't enjoy, meeting people in the middle. So it's going to be very tough to see how they move forwards with this. And one might question that, but you also have to put it into context with everything that's going on. Is that what happened in 2016 with the peace accords? Is the country went through a psychological transition. There's no longer the FARC guerrillas, or as they were. And so the veil was lifted. And you have a country now, a young country, looking for change. They are international, they're worldly, they're well-studied, well-traveled. And they've seen the rest of Latin America making changes, in some cases good ones, in some cases bad ones. You mentioned Venezuela. To mention that, the biggest sort of warning signs and the biggest likelihood we won't become Venezuela because we've got Venezuela alongside us as the warning. So, when people say, oh, we're going to turn into Venezuela, well, it's not going to happen because we have the 2 million Venezuelans in Colombia to tell us don't do that. So I worry that there's going to be a lot of sort of shouting from the balconies. It's like, we weren't able to do this. Gustavo Petro adhering to the international courts of human rights or the inter-American courts saying the establishment are against me. So we'll see.
But let me ask you this, Richard, do you think there is a recognition that by improving the standard of living for the poor, the lives of the wealthy, sometimes more conservative population will improve as well? Or, do they see the actual opposite effect whereby they stand to lose their privileges of having, cheap labor, both in their homes and for commercial and business purposes?
Well, this is a conservative country. Colombia is a conservative country. Not a lot of change has taken place. The only country in the Americas not to have had a land reform. So there's this fear that there'll be, checks and balances on the establishment, on the elites, on the top-ranking politicians. So there's obviously this underlying fear that they might be held to account for something. So, we just weigh it up. We'll see how it goes.
Okay. Sergio, I'll come back to you. I just need to ask you, how really, explain this Colombian dynamic here. How is it such a conservative country, or has at least been in the past, when the majority of the country is so poor? The majority of the population has suffered because of these conservative political and economic policies that don't allow wealth, tremendous wealth that exists in Colombia, to trickle down in any way.
Well, I would, and perhaps Laura can assist me. She's a professor of political science and history. But what I will say is that along Colombia's history, these wealthy landed elites and also urban elites have tried to keep people down in a lot of ways through violence. And we did have a national front in the 1960s and onto the 1970s. And the first bits of the national front tried to address this problem of rural inequality through a land reform, etc. And that didn't come to pass. And we had two elite governments that essentially traded places every 4 years on the arrangement that they would not make substantial changes to the country's economy. And so Colombia sort of continued on this path. And then we had a left-wing insurgency product of the Cold War, among other things, that Colombia's elite and Colombia's establishment embraced as a way not to really address many of these systemic problems that we have. And so what I think is happening, and the effect of what Laura's saying, is the issue of kicking the can down the road and never really implementing the reforms that the country's needed.
Right.
Unfortunately, that's going to come at a very high cost right now.
Indeed, because as we said, the disparities in wealth in Colombia are just remarkable. So Laura, do comment on that for me. And is there still an economically powerful proportion of the population that just does not want to see Pedro and Marquez succeed?
I don't know if I don't like to portray sort of the powerful economic elite as not wanting Marquez and Petro to succeed. I think if you ask a vast majority of them, there will be like, yeah, we want everybody to be on equal footing and so on and so forth. What I don't think they want to do is they don't want to give anything of their own to achieve that goal, right? So I think that's where things get a little complicated. I fully agree with Sergio. I think part of the problem is other Latin American countries have had these conversations in the past. They've had them for 50, 60, 70 years, but we haven't. And part of the reason we haven't is because our national elections have always revolved around the armed conflict. And so sort of socioeconomic issues were always kind of in the back seat. And because they were in the back seat, nobody really talked about them. And that was kind of uncomfortable. We had like an agreement on a certain set of policies, mostly focused on growth rather than redistribution. And there's always a tension, and that tension always plays out in electoral politics. And there should be a tension, to a certain extent. And nobody has ever kind of put this up for debate. And for the first time, it is up for debate. And I can understand how that seeds uncertainty amongst people who are comfortable with the way things are. But I can also understand how this is essential for a huge group who needs these changes to happen. Like Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in Latin America.
Right.
Things need to change, right? I wanted to make a comment about the Venezuela thing because I think this is something is not talked enough. So there's this fear about, quote unquote, Colombia becoming Venezuela with Petro. And so I will say two things. First, I think the uncertainty that Petro generates is true. And the fears are not necessarily based on imaginations. Petro has a very, how to say,
conflictive
he has
management
authoritarian
style.
What is it?
Conflictual management style.
Conflictual management style. That's a fantastic way to put it, right? And so there has been instances in the past in which he has jumped elected bodies to get what he wants, or there has been during this campaign he talked about coup d'états and fraud, what there really did not exist. So this is kind of complicated and problematic. I think that is true. I also think Petro has been a politician since 1990. He has been a member of Congress. He has been a mayor. He knows how the system works. And that is important because that means, and the fact that he has a coalition in Congress suggests that he's going to work through the institutions. He knows how to work these institutions. And that is huge.
Okay.
Because I think, they'll be able to kind of push forward.
Understood. I'll tell you what, I want to look more closely at the economy and how that might change. Because, Petro and Marquez have, let's call them environmental credentials. They want to wean Colombia's economy off its dependence on oil exports, for example. The timing for that platform is very good, given, the overall global effort to adopt more green technology, move away from fossil fuels. And also Marquez has spoken at length, really, about reinvesting in Colombian agriculture, which is another popular idea right now with, global food security in question. So, Richard, the timing really couldn't be better for pitching the platforms that they have campaigned on, could it not?
Well, the timing is perfect, and of course, the electorate, the youth, the nobodies that Francia Marquez referred to as she's one of the nobodies. This goes out there to her base, to their base, of course. Many rural communities. We want to see some wealth redistributed amongst our lands. We want to see an understanding of our communities, and yes, it rings true to this new generation of Colombians out there. And one of the main arguments that seems to come out, obviously, is always about fracking, and there seems to be so much of a debate around this. The former president, the current president, Ivan Duque, he has always been saying, well, no, it's for scientific reasons, and if we're doing this, and if we can't do this, Colombia won't have enough oil. Well, Gustavo Petro's plan is to wean Colombia off the necessity of fossil fuels over 12 years. I mean, this is, and then rely on renewable sources. This doesn't sound unreasonable. I don't know if if it can be put into practice given the sort of the institutions and the interests here, but why not? As you said, the message goes out to the right people at the right time.
Right. Let me ask Sergio about that. I mean, do you think that economic plan can work? Because the global momentum is behind it.
No. And I'll tell you why. Because amongst the things that Colombia exports, 80% of our export basket is oil derivatives, coal, and coal derivatives. And right now, the prices for coal, oil, and oil products are soaring. So Colombia could not be timed this decision worse because it will not take advantage of these potential windfalls.
But this isn't supposed to happen overnight. They're not going to shut this down right now, right? Go ahead.
Right, I agree. But if you think about the medium-term fiscal outlook for Colombia, it's gotten worse overnight for two reasons. Because if you cut oil exploration, you drill a hole and it takes 4 or 5 years to develop that project. In 4 or 5 years, you still have to do coupon payments. You still have to do a lot of things. Moreover, although Colombia exports oil, it imports gasoline. And right now, Colombia has the 19th cheapest gasoline globally. The only two countries that have cheaper gasoline in the Americas are Venezuela and Bolivia. Period. And Colombia's car park is not going to change from carbureting engines to Teslas overnight. So I do think that we're going to have a very rude awakening when it comes to that transition, because we're not going to be able to capitalize on the short-term windfalls and make the necessary adjustments to our economy to be able to capitalize on the long-term adjustments.
Laura, go ahead.
So can I split the baby in the middle? I think the goal is right time. Like, I think the global movement against moving away from fossil fuels is totally right. I think that's right. I also think that Sergio is right in that right now, due mostly to the war in Ukraine, oil prices are soaring. And so, yes, there's going to be a windfall. I will also add, and I think it's important, that Petro is not the first president, left-wing president, that I hear that saying that they're going to wind off oil money and that they're going to diversify the economy and seek further resources. I've heard this from Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, right? And every single time they default into mineral resources because they're giving them a lot of money that help them fulfill their social promises. So I think the goal is right. Whether Petro will do it or not, I think it's a question mark. I think we should get started there. Like, I think this is something we should achieve.
Okay.
I am just not sure that is going to happen as fast.
Understood. I'll tell you what, we're down to our last few minutes. This has to be talked about. Laura, I'll stay with you. Quickly, if you can, what about Colombia's relationship with the United States? I mean, Colombia is Washington's strongest partner, really, in Latin America. And Colombia's right-wing leaning has traditionally fallen in line with the type of policy the U.S. has wanted to see, south of its border. So what now?
I think so. Colombia has had traditionally a very strong relationship. I think Petro himself has good relationships with some members of the Democratic Party, and I think that's important. I think it will largely depend on whether the U.S. supports and acknowledge the fact that Gustavo Petro is going to be the president for the next 4 years, and they need to work with him. And what happens in domestic politics here in the U.S., because of course there is a domestic game here, and if Republicans win Congress or the White House in a couple of years, then these relationships might soar because Republicans do have a very strong discourse against Gustavo Petro. So I think that's going to play in.
Richard, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just thinking about, was it Ron DeSantis, who may well end up being president in 4 years' time, or at least a candidate, and he was talking about how can America do business with this Marxist ex-guerrilla in Colombia. So, like Laura is saying, it's certainly there's going to be a fair amount of saber rattling, but behind the scenes it might still work. I mean, at the end of the day, the U.S. needs the deal. They need the let's say, what do you say, their ally in the region, and Colombia will require the US as well for the markets and so on, and for aid. So they might, sort of spar, but at the same time, it will probably just continue.
Okay. Sergio, we just have a couple minutes left. Let me get your thoughts then on that ever crucial US-Colombia relationship going forward, especially if we're looking at Republicans potentially taking more power in the United States in the initial, years of this new presidency in Colombia.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, the contest between the Democrats and the Republicans is very narrow still. And Republicans are not at all favorable to Gustavo Petro's energy transition policies. They're not favorable to his drug policies. They're not favorable also to renegotiating the U.S.-Colombia free trade agreement that Gustavo Petro has tried to put on the table. There's simply no appetite for that. What there is appetite for, I will wager, is a geopolitical contest between the United States and China. And because of the fiscal situation that I painted for Colombia, I think Gustavo Petro is going to look for additional financing for his social programs, for other things, and he may just gravitate towards China in an effort to fulfill that. If the United States is smart, they will not alienate Petro and push away Petro towards China. But again, the ability of Republicans to read the room is very questionable.
Very interesting. You're actually describing another dynamic in what some are calling the new Cold War. So it'd be fascinating to see how that develops. Some were thinking it might stay away from Latin America entirely, but from what you're saying, that might not be the case. Let's hope, though, that Colombia can work, more independently of the U.S. perhaps than it has in the past, when what some saw as a lot of meddling in Colombia's internal politics from its big neighbor to the north. Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd really like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us: Sergio Guzman, Richard McCall, and Laura Gamboa. Thanks all so much for participating on The Newsmakers. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.